It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Arie Kaplan. Arie is an author and an international speaker. She was born and raised in West Rogers Park, a Jewish community on the north side of Chicago. She received her BA from the University of Illinois, Chicago in nutrition and medical dietetics. She also trained at the Claret Center of Hyde Park as a spiritual director. She maintained a private practice and lectured for many years throughout the Chicago area on general health, weight loss, and spirituality. And after her father died, she began journaling memories that turned into her memoir about conquering the fear and hatred she felt toward him. Arie has been featured on several television and radio news programs, and her articles about her book have been published in many print and online news sites. Welcome, Arie Kaplan. Arie, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And this beautiful Sunday morning, I'm so excited to be here. It's an honor, truly, and the service was beautiful. So thank you. So as Elizabeth said, today I'm going to talk about my memoir called Descendants of Rajgrod-Learning to Forgive. I'm going to share some stories from my memoir and then mostly focus on my process of forgiveness. And the way I was able to work through my process of learning to heal may be different from many others. And I understand that everyone goes through a different, has a different journey. And so what works for me may not work for you. I'm not here to proselytize. I'm here just to share my journey and what has helped me heal. And I wrote this book because there are so many of us who have had difficult childhood. Many of us may have felt abandoned or rejected, unloved, even abused and traumatized from our childhood by relatives or friends or strangers. So I just wanted to share my story and what worked for me and how I was able to move on. So having said that, let's begin. So the Descendants of Rygwood. Rygwood is a town in northeastern Poland. Rygwood actually means the city of paradise. And my father, Avram Yankel Steinsapir, was born in Rygwood, Poland in 1921. And he grew up in a house that faced the town square. Here's a picture of his house in the shtetl, or it's a Yiddish word for a tiny little village in Poland. Kind of, if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, you can have an imagination of what these small little shtetls look like. And in his home, he had his father, Chaim Shlomo, his mother, Bela. He had 3 older sisters, the oldest, Gittel, who left before World War II to Palestine. And then his 2 older sisters, Chaya and Leah, which I was named after in Hebrew. And then his beloved younger sister, Yoshbi, and his baby brother who died when he was 2 years old. My grandfather died when my father was 6 years old. And so his mother, Bela, was left to tend to the house and a farm, which they owned about 2 miles down the road on the outskirts of Rygwood. Life was fairly good for my father and his family, and the Jews, as well as the Christians living in Rygwood, mostly all got along. And my father spoke Polish, spoke Yiddish in the house. He also learned Hebrew with the town rabbi, and also learned some Russian and German along the way throughout the war. But my father's world changed when Germany invaded Poland September 1st, 1939. And if you know the geography of Poland, Poland is sandwiched back then between Germany on its western front and Russia on its eastern front. Can you imagine being sandwiched between Stalin and Hitler? And so Rygwood is northeastern Poland and close to the Russian border. So when the Nazis invaded Poland, World War II began, and immediately within weeks, the Russians then invaded Poland, and they were the first to conquer the city of Rygwood. And when the Russians came to town, to Rygwood, they desecrated the town church. They killed the Catholic priest. They killed about 60 non-Jewish Poles, Christian Poles, and many were sent to work camps. Now, the Jews were treated much better by the Russians, but many of them were sent to fight on the Russian front, which ultimately meant death during the war. And so eventually the Nazis marched further into Poland and the Russians retreated. And now June 22nd, 1941 was when my father's world had changed. The Nazis marched into Rygwood. And they wanted to bring 100 Jews to the center of town. And they asked many of the Poles, or they've asked some of the ethnic villagers who lived there to bring 100 Jews. And my grandmother had hired 2 workers to help on her farm once my grandfather had died. And these 2 workers forced their way into my father's home. So my father's Holocaust began with a home invasion. And my father witnessed this event from a hiding place. And he saw these 2 men come into his house, grab his mother and 2 older sisters, one with the baby, and drag them outside. And he heard his mother, Bela, pleading, please, please have mercy on me. Kill me quickly. And with that, they took their time butchering his mother and his sisters to death. And my father, traumatized after witnessing this horrific experience, he ran into the woods, into the forests of Rygwood, further into the forests of Eastern Europe. And he never looked back, and he never went home. As to the fate of the Jews of Rygwood, those 100 Jews were forced to stand 4 by 4, marching down the main road naked, while the Poles were forced to cheer them on the sides. They were led by some Nazis who led them into the forests of Rygwood, where they were all killed. The Poles were then forced to dig a mass grave and bury the Jews. The remainder of the Jews were forced to live in a ghetto right near my grandmother's house. And then eventually 3 months later, they were all transported to Treblinka, where they were all gassed to death. So my father spent 3.5 years in the forests of Eastern Europe. He lived like a mountain man. When he could, he went into the villages and found scraps of food, drank water from pails of water, took clothes on the clotheslines, did whatever he could to survive, often in the winter, sleeping in barns covered with hay, hiding. Eventually, the war ended in 1950. My father was on one of the first ships that left to America he stayed in Bergen-Belsen, where he worked and he taught. And he was one of the first refugees released from Bergen-Belsen on this ship from Germany all the way to America. And he went through Ellis Island and he made his way to Chicago. And a few years later, He met my mother on the west side of Chicago at a Jewish dance, and he married her, and he had 3 children. I'm the youngest of 2 older brothers. My brother Howard was a rabbi, and my brother Barry lives in California, an architect. And as Elizabeth mentioned, I graduated as a nutritionist. My father could never forget those gruesome years in Poland. He hardened his heart, and he was filled with so much anger, and he could never let this go. And so I was raised in an abusive household. We were all abused in many different ways in our home. There was physical and verbal and emotional and financial and sexual abuse toward different members of our family. My mother tried to protect us, but she married my father at 19 years old and was a battered woman. She did her best, and she showed me what unconditional love was all about. In our home, we were also, as Elizabeth mentioned, raised in West Rogers Park, a Jewish neighborhood. So I grew up observing the Sabbath and keeping kosher, and went to private Jewish school for 12 years. And so my education was learning Hebrew in the morning, taking all my Jewish classes in the morning, and then having my English or secular subjects in the afternoon. Now, years later, I'm going to skip until I was in my late 30s, early 40s, and I was married, and I had 3 children, and my brother had died. He was a rabbi. He died in 1991 unexpectedly in his sleep with 2 young children. My father was devastated. He hardened his heart even more. Howard, my oldest brother, was the child that my father loved and respected out of everyone in my family. And he knew he had a rotten deal in life when his son died. My mother, devastated and went into a deeper depression, and she died in 1997. And that's when my world fell apart. And so I was married with 3 young children, unhappy, unsettled, not knowing what to do, what to make of my life. And I eventually divorced in 2003 with 3 young children, still feeling unsettled, letting go of much of my religious doctrine, still feeling connected to my tribe, but letting go of a lot of these rules that I didn't feel were spiritually uplifting me. Finally, I went to a therapist, and the therapist noticed something about me that I've never noticed. And she said, Karen, just as your father was holding on to 70 years, 7 decades worth of anger, you too are holding on to anger, and you're bitter and you're resentful from your childhood. It's time to let this go. And I didn't realize how my childhood had affected my adult life. And I said, well, how do I do this? And she said, it's time to forgive your father. And I looked at her and I thought, forgive my father? And I started to explain to her, you see, what I learned about forgiveness in my modern Orthodox background was through my rabbis at my school. My rabbis were my teachers. And my rabbis taught me that in Judaism, you cannot forgive someone unless they ask. So I said to my therapist, my father is never going to ask me for forgiveness. My father doesn't believe he did anything wrong. My father would say, if he did beat us, you deserved it. So I explained to my therapist that no, there's nothing to forgive here. And I said, in Judaism, the person who's hurt you or harmed you is obligated to ask you for forgiveness. And you do not have to forgive them the first time or the second time, but on the third time, the person asks you with contrition, with love in their heart. If you don't forgive them, then the onus will fall on you. So none of this was ever going to happen in my household. My father was never going to ask me for forgiveness. So I explained to her, there's nothing to forgive. But she tried to help me understand that forgiveness is not so much about the perpetrator, but it's about the victim. She said, Karen, you need to learn to heal from your past. It doesn't benefit you by holding on to this anger, this resentment. It not only hurts you, but it hurts the people around you. It's time to let go so that you can heal and move forward. Because if you're hanging on to this anger and this bitterness, you can't move on. It's as if you're replaying these experiences in your mind of what happened during childhood over and over like a broken record. They may have happened once, twice, or a few times, but you're imagining that they've been happening over and over as if it happened yesterday. She says, it's time to let this go. And so the first stage of my process of forgiveness was really an intellectual understanding of what the word means. And so it took me about 2 to 3 months to finally understand what she's trying to teach me, how she's trying to help me. And then I came back to her a few months later and I said, now what? All right, I understand that it will benefit me. It'll also benefit the people around me and my children as well. I'll be lighter and happier. And she said, well, Karen, why don't you go back and think about what has happened in your childhood? Think about maybe some experiences that made you uncomfortable and go with that. And so I started to recollect experiences that happened in my home. And the anger that had built up that kind of stayed in my body. I became like a volcano and purging all this anger. And I let go of this bitterness and resentment. It took me about 2 years and I did a lot of crying and mostly in the shower so my children wouldn't hear me. And I just let go of all this negative emotions. And that became my second stage of forgiveness. And finally, when there were no more tears left, I talked to my therapist and said, I'm not sure what else to do. I have not yet forgiven my father. She says, just take your time and just take it slowly. Now, my father's health was deteriorating, and my brother Barry and I had placed my dad in a nursing home in Riverwoods so that I can be close to him. And I went to visit him each and every day in the morning. And one morning when I came there, he was laying in bed and I saw he was building fluid up in his body, in his hands and his feet, and he was unresponsive and swollen. And I asked the nurse to call 911 and he was rushed to the Highland Park ICU, and I followed the emergency vehicle. And my father laid in the ICU comatose for 7 days. And each day I'd go to the hospital in the morning. I would don the mask and the hat and the covering and the gloves, and I'd sit in the corner of his room watching the doctor and the nurses take care of him, and quietly sat there. And on the 7th day, right before I walked into my father's room, I heard the doctor say, I can't believe this man is still alive. And I immediately walked in and I said to the doctor, excuse me, but please don't talk that way in front of my father. He's a Holocaust survivor. And the doctor said, well, now I understand. And he left the room. And the nurse finished up and she left the room. And I sat there again in the corner listening to the humming sounds of the IV machines and the heart machines, and something happened to me right then and there. My heart swelled for the first time with compassion for my father. I've never felt that way toward him before. And I got up from my chair and I walked to my father's bed. He laid there. And I took his hand, his swollen hand, his arm was bruised, and I put his hand in mine, and I brushed the hair off of his forehead. And I noticed he had 2 vertical grooves between his eyebrows. It looked like he was in pain. And I held my father's hand and I said to him, "Daddy, it's time to let go. Your father, Chaim Shlomo, your mother, Bela, your sisters, your baby brother, they're all waiting for you. Daddy, let go. You've suffered your entire life. You don't need to suffer in death. Let go." And I started to weep. Then I looked at my father and I said, "Daddy, I forgive you. I want you to know that I truly forgive you." And I started to cry. I looked at my father and I noticed his eyes just popped wide open. And I moved to the right and he tracked me. And I moved to the left and he followed me once again. And I thought, is my father, the Holocaust survivor, cheating death one more time? And I ran out to the room to get the nurse. And I said, "Nurse, nurse, please come. My father is waking up." And we came back to his room and my father's eyes were closed once again. He died the next morning. We buried my father a few days later. And I realized that while that coffin was slowly going into the ground, that I had forgiven my father, that my heart was filled with love and compassion for him. On the other hand, my brother standing next to me as the coffin was lowered into the ground said to me, "Karen, I wanted to take that pail and shovel and throw it at his coffin. I hate that man and I hope he ends up in hell." My brother Barry received an inordinate amount of abuse, more than anyone in my family. And I understood his pain and I understood his anger. I had wished he had learned to forgive, but we all have a different timeline and we all are at different moments in our life when we're ready and when we're not. And so the third stage of my forgiveness was filling my heart up with compassion for my father. And the final stage for me was uttering the words, "I forgive you." Then I wondered, what if my father was able to forgive those men that murdered his family, those Nazis for gassing his family? Would my childhood have been better? What if I go back to Rygwood? What if I go back to his hometown? Could I forgive those men? After all, they murdered my family. They took a family away from me. I never knew my grandmother. I never knew my aunts and cousins. And so I decided I'm going to go to Poland to go to Rygwood. And so I asked a few friends what they thought. One girlfriend, who's actually a child of a Holocaust survivor, a child during the Holocaust, said, she yelled at me, she said, "That's absurd. No, you can't forgive, never, ever." Another girlfriend who knew that I was writing a memoir said, "Karen, be very careful what you write in your book. It sounds very Christian-like." Another friend said, "Karen, I haven't forgiven the Babylonians yet." And that was 2,500 years ago. As you can see, many of us still hang on to the pain of our ancestral lineage of suffering generation after generation. So I went back to Rygwood and had so many interesting and synchronistic experiences that happened. But I'm going to just share with you one story. I went with my boyfriend at the time, who is now my husband, and we went with a travel guide. And we came to my father's home. And right next to his home is the bus station. It's a small little mustard bus station. Right here in back, there's an opening to the yard. When we had knocked on the door, nobody answered in this home. So we went around between the bus station and my father's home, and we saw there was an old shack, must have been over 100 years old. It was slightly open. There was a little dog running around in the yard. I thought maybe that was the shack where my father hid and witnessed the murder of his family. My tour guide yelled out. We thought someone was in there, and he said, "Hello, hello. I am a tour guide. This woman here is the granddaughter of Bella Steinsapir. Her father had just died. She came here. She wants to come inside the home and just look around." A woman came out of the shack. She said, "Yes, my mother bought this house. We knew that Bella Steinsapper had lived there, but we bought this house from the government. And no, you may not enter my home." I didn't blame her, because if 3 strangers came knocking at my door, I wouldn't let them in. She said, "We asked, can I come into the yard and say a prayer for her family that died?" And she said, "No, you can stand right where you are, because your grandmother your grandma also owned that bus station, the land there." So my tour guide had left me. My boyfriend, my now husband, was filming from a distance. And I stood there and I wanted to say a prayer for my father, for my family, for all the Jews of Rygwood, for all those Jewish souls who died, who were murdered there. And I said this Hebrew prayer called the Kaddish, which generally takes me a minute to recite, but I wanted to recite this prayer out loud. I wanted every soul in this town, Jewish soul, know that they have not been forgotten, that a granddaughter has come back to say prayers for them. And I started to say in Hebrew, Yit Kadal v'Yit Kadash Shemei Rabbah. And each word, as I said, I started to cry. And my crying and my moaning got louder and louder, but I forced myself to say each and every word out loud. It took me a half an hour. I was weeping and weeping with my head in my palms. When I came back from that trip from Poland, back to Chicago, I realized it was at that moment in Rygwood that I had forgiven those that murdered my family. And I felt as if this lineage of pain and suffering that passed through the veins from generation to generation of my people, I had finally let this go. I didn't want to carry the suffering anymore. It felt as if a burden has been lifted off my shoulders. I finished writing my memoir. And before I went into production, I had a thought. I said, as difficult as it was to forgive my father, I forgave him, but he couldn't hurt me anymore. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. He was on his deathbed. And as difficult as it was to forgive those Nazis and perpetrators who murdered my family and 6 million of my people, I forgave them. And there's no Nazi gonna come and knock on my door. Nothing to fear. But what if someone would dare hurt my children? That to me would be the ultimate challenge of forgiveness. A few weeks later, it was it was March 19th, 2013. It was 11 p.m. at night. 2 of my 3 children were home with me. They came in from Champaign from spring break. 3 masked men with guns and ties entered my home. I won't go through the entire story, but we all had guns to our heads. I was tied up. My son was tied up and gagged. But my daughter, who had a premonition 6 months prior, knew exactly what to do. She called 911 on her cell phone, hid in her room, locked her door. Within seconds, the 3rd thug entered her room and put a gun to her head and said, "Give me the phone." She handed him the phone and he saw that they were on their way. The emergencies were on their way. They ran out of the house. What I learned from this experience was that my father's Holocaust that began with a home invasion, and 70 years later, his daughter, I am having a home invasion of myself. I know I'm not going to repeat his feelings, carrying this anger in my heart towards these men. The police said we were lucky we survived because they pulled down their face mask and I saw them. He said, "You were going to get killed." We were extremely lucky. And I knew that I couldn't hold on to this anger and this pain. I didn't want to repeat my father's way of life, but I wanted justice. I wanted those men caught. And for 6 months, I spent my time on looking through newspapers, online articles, looking at mugshots, whatever I could to find out if these these thugs were caught. The police said, "No, not yet." But I didn't want to carry this pain with me any longer. But I wanted justice, and I realized that justice is not going to bring me peace. Forgiveness is what will bring me peace and heal. And so I forgave those men. I added that story of my home invasion into the epilogue of my memoir. And since then, I've been speaking and sharing the story of healing and forgiveness. Thank you.